He gave up his seat to a pregnant woman, and what happened next left everyone speechless. The train station was alive with the usual symphony of activity, the hiss of doors opening, the echo of footsteps, and the faint murmur of countless conversations blending into the background. Elijah, a young black man in his late 20s, adjusted his backpack as he stepped onto the subway platform. Although he was tired after a grueling shift at the auto repair shop, the thought of getting home to his little sister's birthday dinner kept him moving forward. At that precise moment, as the train screeched to a halt, he joined the throng of commuters with a quiet determination. Elijah squeezed himself into the already crowded car and managed to find a small spot by the door, his hand gripping the overhead bar for balance. As he settled in, his eyes fell upon a woman across from him who was clearly pregnant. She clutched a sturdy pole in one hand while gripping her oversized bag in the other. Her face was wet with perspiration, and her legs trembled as the train jerked forward unexpectedly. Without hesitation, Elijah rose to his feet and with a kind yet firm gesture offered her his vacant seat. "Here, ma'am. You look like you could use this," he said. The woman hesitated momentarily, her eyes revealing both embarrassment and gratitude. Eventually she gave him a grateful smile and murmured, "Thank you so much," as she sank into the seat. Elijah nodded politely and then shifted to stand closer to the door. He glanced at his watch and noted that there was still enough time to reach dinner if the train stayed on schedule. For a brief moment he felt good about his small act of kindness. A simple gesture that, in his eyes, was more than enough to brighten someone's day. However, the peaceful moment was abruptly shattered. As the train pulled into the next station, the woman's head suddenly slumped forward. Her bag slid noisily to the floor, and she collapsed onto her knees, gasping for air. In that instant, the entire car fell silent. A man nearby shouted, "Someone help her!" Instinctively, Elijah moved toward the fallen woman. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked as he crouched beside her in concern. At the same time, another passenger cried out for someone to pull the emergency brake. Chaos erupted, voices overlapping, panic seeping into every word as people scrambled to call 911. The air became thick with confusion and dread. Despite the mayhem, Elijah stayed by the woman's side, unsure what else to do. Then, as other passengers helped her into a sitting position, the woman pointed directly at him. With a weak but piercing voice, she gasped, It was him. He did something to me." At first her murmur was low and almost imperceptible, but it soon grew insidiously louder. People around Elijah began exchanging suspicious glances, and the atmosphere in the car shifted ominously. For a brief second, Elijah thought he must have misheard her. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of her words. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady yet edged with disbelief. The woman repeated herself, this time louder and clearer. "He did something to me." She clutched her stomach, wincing, and the surrounding passengers shifted uncomfortably. "Whoa, hold on," Elijah said, raising his hands in a defensive gesture. "I didn't do anything. I only gave you my seat." Yet the murmurs only intensified, swelling into a wave of suspicion that rippled through the crowded car. A man in a grey suit, who had been standing near the woman, spoke up, furrowing his brow as he demanded, "I saw him standing close to her. What were you doing near her bag?" Elijah turned toward the man, incredulous. "I wasn't near her bag. I was standing by the door the whole time," he insisted. But it seemed his protest was futile. People were already forming their own versions of events, their assumptions filling in the gaps. A woman with a stroller muttered something under her breath and cast a weary glance at Elijah, as if to say, "I knew it." Before long, an older man with glasses stepped forward and positioned himself between Elijah and the pregnant woman, as though trying to shield her from further harm. "Someone call the police," a voice shouted from the back of the car. Elijah's stomach sank. "Why would you call the cops?" he demanded, his voice cracking, not out of fear but sheer frustration. "I didn't do anything," he protested. The train then screeched to a halt at the next station. Moments later, 2 transit officers boarded the car, and their presence only served to intensify the tension in the air. "What's going on here?" one of the officers demanded, surveying the chaotic scene. Passengers immediately began talking over one another, pointing fingers and offering fragmented accounts of what they believed had happened. "She collapsed and he was right there," one woman said, nodding toward Elijah. "He gave up his seat, but then, I don't know, something just doesn't add up." another passenger added hesitantly. The officers exchanged a look and then turned their attention to Elijah, who now stood frozen in place with his hands raised slightly as if to prove he meant no harm. "You step off the train," one officer ordered, gesturing toward him, "so we can sort this out." "I didn't do anything," Elijah protested, his voice growing firmer. "I only gave up my seat. Ask anyone." The officers exchanged another glance before one finally said, "We'll figure this out. Let's go." Before Elijah could move, a teenage girl with braids who had been sitting near the back of the car suddenly stood up, holding her phone high. "Wait," she called out, her voice slicing through the escalating tension. "I saw the entire thing. He didn't touch her or her stuff. He literally just gave her his seat." Her words hung in the air like a small crack in the wall of suspicion, but they did little to dissolve the doubt entirely. Soon after, the pregnant woman groaned again, clutching her stomach as she struggled. One of the officers crouched beside her and asked gently, "What happened, ma'am? Did someone harm you?" With a trembling voice, she pointed directly at Elijah and repeated, "It was him. I felt dizzy after he stood so close. I don't know what he did, but it was him." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. He desperately wanted to scream, to demand an explanation for why she was accusing him, but he remembered his father's advice. Stay calm, no matter what, and never give them a reason to see you as a threat. The officers, now visibly more alert, instructed him again, "Sir, please step aside. This is just protocol. We need to get her medical attention and figure out what happened." Reluctantly, Elijah nodded and followed them off the train, acutely aware of every pair of eyes fixed on him as he walked. The whispers behind him stung more deeply than he cared to admit. Outside the train, the tension only grew heavier as more officers arrived and additional passengers spilled onto the platform. Their retellings of the incident grew increasingly dramatic, and soon the situation began to take an even darker turn. Elijah stood on the platform, leaning his back against the cold concrete wall, while two officers questioned him. A small crowd had gathered, whispering and pointing. The pregnant woman sat a few feet away on a bench, clutching her belly and shaking her head as paramedics examined her intermittently. Her gaze flickered toward Elijah, a mixture of fear and accusation in her eyes. "Let me get this straight," said the taller officer, flipping open his notepad. "You're saying you gave up your seat, and that's all that happened?" "Yes," Elijah replied firmly. "That's all I did. I don't even know this woman." The shorter officer then asked, "Then why would she accuse you of something? People don't just make these things up." Elijah clenched his fists and forced himself to remain calm. "I don't know why she's saying this. Maybe she's confused, or maybe something else is going on, but I did nothing wrong." From behind the officers, a middle-aged woman in a red coat stepped forward. "I saw him too," she said hesitantly. "He was acting kind of too close to her, you know what I mean." Elijah's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? I wasn't anywhere near her except to offer my seat." The taller officer then addressed the woman directly. "Ma'am, did you see anything else suspicious?" She shook her head slowly. "No, but I think it's worth looking into. You can't be too careful these days." Her words hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. He turned to the officers, his voice rising with frustration. "This is ridiculous. You're taking her word and a bunch of guesses over facts. Check the security cameras if you don't believe me." The officers exchanged a glance and one sighed. "We're working on it. Just cooperate, okay?" Meanwhile, the crowd grew restless and voices in the gathering began to speculate wildly. "He probably slipped something into her drink," one man muttered. "Or maybe he tried to take her bag," another suggested. A woman added, "Look at him, he's so defensive. That's a red flag." Elijah heard every word, and his blood boiled with indignation. Before he could speak further, the teenage girl who had defended him earlier stepped forward again, holding her phone. "Excuse me," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the chatter. "I have a video. I was recording a TikTok when this happened. Look." She handed her phone to the shorter officer, who watched the video carefully. The screen clearly showed Elijah standing by the door, his hands on the rail, minding his own business. The moment he gave up his seat was unmistakable, as was the distance between him and the pregnant woman thereafter. The officer's expression softened slightly as he handed the phone to his partner. "This doesn't show any contact between him and the woman," he admitted. The taller officer frowned, then turned to the pregnant woman. "Ma'am, Are you absolutely sure it was him? Her face crumpled and tears began to spill down her cheeks as she stammered, I don't know. I felt dizzy and he was right there. I just assumed. Elijah felt a mix of relief and frustration. You assumed, he repeated in an icy tone. You have half this platform thinking I'm some kind of criminal just because of assumptions? The crowd's whispers shifted, now laden with uncertainty, some faces showing embarrassment, while others doubled down on their suspicions. Just as things seemed to be settling, one of the paramedics spoke up. Her blood pressure is dangerously low. This could explain the dizziness and confusion, but we need to get her to the hospital for tests. The officers nodded in agreement before turning back to Elijah. We're not detaining you, said the taller officer, though his tone remained apologetic, but we'll need to file a report. Stay nearby in case we need more information. Elijah's jaw tightened as he replied, Fine, do what you have to do. As the paramedics led the woman away and the crowd slowly dispersed, Elijah remained on the platform, shaken but not broken. The damage, however, had been done, and the fight for his dignity was far from over. Elijah leaned against a cold steel pillar as the remaining onlookers gradually departed. A few stragglers lingered, casting furtive glances his way, though most people seemed eager to leave the uncomfortable scene behind. In his mind, every fiber of his being screamed at the injustice of how quickly assumptions had painted him as the villain. He noticed the teenage girl who had defended him earlier standing nearby, scrolling through her phone. When she looked up and caught his eye, she offered him a small, apologetic smile. Thanks for speaking up, he said, his voice strained but sincere. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to, she replied simply. It's just messed up how everyone jumped on you like that. People always assume the worst for no reason. Her words resonated with him, lingering in the air. No reason, Elijah thought, though he knew from experience that there was rarely no reason. He had seen it before, felt it before. Just then, one of the officers approached him again. Listen, the taller officer began in a more measured tone. We reviewed the security footage from the train. It backs up what you said. You didn't do anything wrong. You're free to go. Elijah let out a sharp exhale, relief flooding through him. I told you that from the start, the officer said, his voice edged with a hint of regret. He shifted uncomfortably and added, Yeah, well, we had to be thorough. You know how it is. Elijah stared at him, the words catching in his throat. Did the officer truly understand what it was like? Or was he merely excusing the implicit bias that had colored the entire situation? Before Elijah could respond further, the paramedics returned from the ambulance parked outside. One of them walked over to Elijah and one of the officers. She's stabilized now, the paramedic said. It turns out her dizziness was caused by a severe drop in blood pressure, nothing to do with anyone on the train. It could have happened anywhere. The officer nodded, as if that settled the matter. All right, thanks for the update, he said, then turned back to Elijah. Looks like this was all just a big misunderstanding. Elijah's heart clenched bitterly at the word misunderstanding. It seemed too light, too casual for the gravity of what had just transpired. Misunderstanding, he repeated in an icy tone. Do you have any idea what it's like to have a whole train of people look at you like you're a criminal? To hear them whisper and point fingers based solely on assumptions? The officer looked down awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. Look, I get it, okay, but it's over now, you can go. Elijah laughed bitterly. It's over for you. For me, he said. This will stick in my mind every time I board a train, every time someone looks at me sideways. The officer said nothing more, and after a moment, walked away. Not long after, the teenage girl approached Elijah again, still holding her phone. I posted the video, she said softly. The whole thing, from you giving up your seat to everyone blaming you. People need to see what really happened. Elijah blinked, taken aback. You didn't have to do that, he replied. I wanted to. People need to stop jumping to conclusions. Maybe this will make someone think twice next time, she said. Elijah nodded, appreciating her gesture, even if he wasn't sure it would change anything. At last, as he finally made his way out of the station, his phone buzzed with a message from his sister, asking if he was still coming to her birthday dinner. Elijah hesitated briefly before replying, the weight of the evening pressing on him, but he knew he couldn't let it ruin the one bright spot in his day. I'm on my way, he texted. Yet, as he walked through the city streets, he couldn't shake the nagging thought. How many others had faced the same rush to judgment without someone like that brave teenager to stand up for them? How often did those stories end differently? Later that evening, Elijah sat at his sister's dining table. The room was filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses as his little sister blew out her birthday candles. The warmth of family managed to ease some of the tension still knotted in his chest. Yet his mind kept circling back to the events of the day, the way assumptions can snowball, how a simple act of kindness can be twisted into suspicion, and how fragile trust among strangers really is. After the cake was cut and the dishes cleared, Elijah stepped out onto a small balcony to savor a moment of quiet. His sister joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "You okay?" she asked, sensing that something was off. Elijah hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just had a rough ride home." Although she did not press him for further details, he could tell she wanted to know more. Finally, he sighed and recounted every detail, from the moment he gave up his seat to the unfounded accusations and the courageous teenage girl who had defended him. When he finished, she shook her head, her expression a mix of sadness and anger. "It's not fair," she murmured softly. "You did the right thing, and yet somehow you still ended up being painted as the bad guy." Elijah nodded, staring out at the city lights. "It's not just me, though. This happens to people all the time. I was lucky that girl had my back, because not everyone gets that chance." His sister rested a hand on his shoulder and said, "You can't control what people assume, Eli, but you can control how you handle it. You stayed calm and stood your ground, and that says a lot about who you are." Elijah thought about her words. In that moment, he realized that although he hadn't felt calm in the heat of the moment, looking back, his restraint might have made all the difference. Then a thought struck him. Kindness isn't always easy, and it doesn't always pay off the way you expect, but it matters. The world is too quick to judge, too quick to assume, and someone has to break that cycle. Taking a deep breath, he turned to his sister. "You know what? I'll do it again," he said quietly, even though he knew exactly how it might turn out. "That's why I'm proud of you," she replied with a small smile. As Elijah finally left the station that day, his story served as a reminder for everyone to pause, reflect, and challenge their own assumptions. Acts of kindness, even when met with resistance, can ripple out in ways we never see. And next time you find yourself in a moment of judgment, stop and ask, what's the full story? A couple of local cops thought they'd give me a warm welcome to their town. They tied me to a lamppost in the middle of the street, putting on a show like I was just another nobody. Little did they know who they were really messing with, or how this would eventually blow up in their faces. Let's start from the beginning. So, here's the deal. Names are important in a story like this, but for now, just know that I went by Danny 54, a guy who'd been around the block a few times. I had just moved to this little middle-of-nowhere town in South Carolina to take up the badge as chief of police. It wasn't my first rodeo. I'd seen plenty in my time. But this place had a vibe like no other. In this town, everyone knew each other, and they didn't exactly seem thrilled about fresh faces. It didn't take long before I noticed that the local cops here seemed to enjoy keeping their own rule book. On my first day, before reporting in, I decided to take a stroll to see what I was dealing with. There I was, blending in with my worn-out cap and an old jacket, just another guy on the street. I walked into a local cafe, the kind of place that looked like it had been around longer than I had. The second I stepped in, I felt a dozen eyes on me. The classic, "you don't belong here" vibe. In the corner, two cops were laughing their heads off about something. I could tell by the way they kept sneaking glances at me that I was the punchline. Their eyes sized me up as if they had already decided I was a nobody. Someone either worth ignoring or, worse, someone worth messing with. Their badges practically sparkled in the dim light, but their manners were far from sparkling. I ordered a coffee and tried to play it cool, just to see how they'd react. I hadn't planned on revealing who I was just yet. This was my recon mission. But then, as I took my coffee to go, one of them barked from across the room. "Hey, old man, you lost or something? 'Cause you sure don't look local." I half turned, keeping my expression blank, and replied casually that I was just passing through. Clearly, they weren't buying it. One of them, a tall guy with a smug grin, shot back, "Well, maybe keep passing. Strangers don't last long around here, if you get my drift." I merely shrugged and walked out, though I could feel their eyes watching my every step down the street. Something told me that my new job was going to be about a lot more than just paperwork and meetings. The next morning I decided to go for a run just outside of town, to clear my head and get a feel for the place. Fresh air, a little peace. Nothing out of the ordinary. Halfway through my run I heard the sound of a patrol car pulling up alongside me, and yep, it was those same two from the cafe, Jake and Mike, the so-called dynamic duo. Jake, a tall, wiry blonde with that signature smirk, leaned out of the window and shouted, "Hey runner, you lost your way!" He joked as though I'd just wandered onto some private property marked with a no trespassing sign. His partner, Mike, a bulky guy who looked like he could bench press half a car, chimed in, "Yeah, are you sure you're welcome around here?" I kept my cool, slowed down a bit and replied, "I'm just going for a run. Pretty sure that's still allowed, right?" Mike shot me a grin, the kind that said, "I know something you don't." Maybe he did, but strangers in this town never received the warmest welcomes, especially if they didn't know the local rules. Before I could even ask what that was supposed to mean, they hopped out of the car. Jake stepped up way too close and started rifling through my pockets without so much as asking, "May I?" I took a deep breath and kept myself calm as they rummaged around, throwing smug glances at each other as if this was some kind of game. Finally, Jake pulled out a random scrap of plastic from my pocket. His face lit up with a twisted excitement. "Well, well, look what we have here," he sneered, holding it aloft like a trophy. "Is this yours?" I simply stared at him, refusing to take the bait. It was obvious they'd planned this little setup. By this point I'd had enough of their so-called friendly welcome, but I knew I had to keep my cool. They had no idea who I was, and this was not the moment for a big reveal. I played it calm, even as they each grabbed one of my arms and yanked me toward the center of town, without offering any explanations or asking any questions, just dragging me along like a lost pet. They hauled me right over to a large lamppost in the middle of the town square where locals milled about, going about their usual morning routines. A few people stopped out of curiosity, while others didn't seem surprised at all, as if they'd seen this sort of thing before. Jake and Mike, meanwhile, were putting on a twisted show. They cracked jokes like they were at a comedy club, acting like local celebrities. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake announced with a mocking bow, "we got ourselves a real big city troublemaker here." Mike added, "Yup, think he's got a few tricks up his sleeve, or maybe in his pockets." They tied my hands around the lamppost in a dramatic fashion, ensuring everyone could see. People began pulling out their phones, recording the spectacle as if it were the highlight of their day, while others simply chuckled and shook their heads. I could see Jake soaking it all in, his smirk growing as he looked around at his audience. Leaning in close, loud enough for everyone to hear, he sneered, "Looks like we got ourselves a troublemaker, huh? Can't have people like you just waltzing into our town." The whole scene was beyond ridiculous. It wasn't funny. It was disturbing. These guys were so engrossed in their act that they didn't care how obvious their setup was. I'd seen some low moves in my day, but this was something else. I had to remind myself to stay calm and let them dig their own hole. So there I was, tied to that lamppost like a public attraction, while Jake and Mike strutted around as though they'd bagged the year's biggest catch. They made no effort to keep it low-key. Everywhere people were filming and laughing, some genuinely curious, others just amused. It turned out that the scene did not remain a local secret for long. By the next morning, clips of the mysterious stranger tied to the pole were blowing up online. Comments flooded in, and theories began to roll in. Some folks thought I was a drifter who had crossed the wrong line. Others were straight up calling out the cops, demanding to know who I was and why I looked like I belonged in some old Wild West show. People wanted answers, and fast. Before long, local news caught wind of the whole affair. Journalists swarmed the scene, pushing through the crowd, eager to catch a quote or two. One reporter even cornered a bystander, asking, "What did this man do? Did anyone see him commit a crime?" The bystander simply shrugged and muttered, "Beats me, looks like the cops were just having some fun." Meanwhile, Jake and Mike continued to strut around, pacing like they owned the square, cracking jokes and making a spectacle of it. They acted as if they were in control, but the story was spiraling out of their hands, and I could sense that the spotlight was now on me. Soon enough, the real show was about to begin. After what felt like the longest night ever, my phone rang early in the morning. The caller ID showed it was from the main office, and I knew exactly why they were calling. Word had reached the chain of command, and they were not happy. Our town's idea of fun had now turned into a full-blown scandal, and Jake and Mike were about to get a rude awakening.